So my name is Anna Guida. I work at Fourth. I'm a program manager too, and I lead the Charge at Home program, which we'll talk a little bit more about briefly in a few moments. I have some quick introductions to make for our great panelists, Don Burke and Whit Jameson. But before that, I have a few quick tips. Please make sure your mic is muted. At the end, when we have time for questions, you're welcome to come off mute when we address your question. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'll be recording those and we can let Whit and Don address those at the end of the presentation. If we're not able to address your question during this session, we will email you and address the question to the best of our ability. If you do include your email address in your question, that'll make it super easy for us to reach out to you after. Okay, amazing. So let's start with Whit Jameson. Whit is a senior specialist here at Fourth. He has an extensive background in multifamily EV charging and electric transportation. So we're super happy to have Whit on today. Don Burke is a veteran of condominiums with 25 plus years of board leadership and a 33-year career with the Community Associations Institute, which he has since retired from. He worked to solve the unique challenges of condo electrification, resilience, and energy efficiency. And now Don dedicates his time to climate initiatives and serves on the board as a board president of a 400-unit high-rise in Alexandria. So thank you so much for both being here. We can advance the next slide, Whit. Amazing. So briefly, Charge at Home is Fourth's multifamily EV charging program. We provide guidance and technical assistance to multifamily decision makers, so anywhere from developers, HOAs, condo boards, property managers, property owners, as well as residents, to make informed decisions about EV charging at their property. And this is a free program. Next slide, please. Some services we provide, we have some great market segmented multifamily EV charging installation toolkits. So we have 7 toolkits per property type for both new and existing buildings. We have lots of one-pagers. We have project case studies from across the country, and we're always generating more. We have an EV charging project builder tool, and I can drop the links for these later, and we'll also share the slides. This is all hyperlinked. We also have resident empowerment resources and our free EV charging consultation program, which we'll talk about in a second. Next slide, please. Yes, case study library. Don't have to spend a ton of time on this, but I would encourage you to check it out. We have a great condos case study about direct to meter wiring. Next slide. So our EV charging consultation program is a great program. You can submit a request to chat with our team about your specific property, and we'll guide you through either basic EV charging 101 all the way down to helping you plan and make decisions about EV charging at your property as a third party support. So that is a free program. Contact us for more information. Next slide, please, Whit. Amazing. So there are lots of ways to get involved. Share our information and newsletters if you feel like it's helpful for you, or on your LinkedIn. Reach out to us if you want to do some co-creation of case studies or content. You know, we're here for you. And then also Fourth is a 501c3. So we're always seeking new opportunities to continue this work. Next slide. Okay, I'll pass it off to Whit. Thank you so much. And I'll be monitoring the chat.
Perfect. Wanted to invite you all to join Fourth at our Roadmap conference in September. It's a fantastic conference where you can really dive in deep and have great conversations with a lot of different transportation electrification professionals across the industry. All right. So today's webinar, we're going to go through sort of some baseline background information on condos, talk a bit more about some of the level setting around electric vehicle charging at condos. So we're sort of what setups are common. We'll talk a little bit more about governance documents and condominium politics and how that factors into some of the decision-making processes for EV charging at condos and within condo boards. We'll talk briefly about the condo toolkits that Don and I really worked a lot on last year. And all part of that will be sort of a conversation between Don and I around some of the biggest barriers that we've seen, some of the challenges, and ways to address some of those challenges. And then we'll have open Q&A. All that is to sort of go after those objectives down at the bottom. And of course, we'll talk about a lot of different condo aspects and EV charging there. All right, and Don's gonna to jump in on a couple of these slides as well. So just wanted to make sure everybody isn't surprised by that, I guess. Yeah. All right. Do sorry that. All right. So here's some background data on condos. It's not a very precise number, and it's kind of funny that we don't have better data on that. But between the Census Bureau and the Foundation for Community Association Research, which is the research arm of the Community Association Institute, um, you can put that data together and sort of estimate somewhere between 25 and 30 million people. But it's particularly tricky given that sometimes condo units are rented out. Sometimes condos are second homes or beyond first homes, so people don't live in them full time. And I wish there was slightly better data on that, but we're working with what we got. Most unit owners have at least one vehicle, and most condo renters have at least one vehicle and use it regularly. And then a good portion, 40%, have two or more vehicles as well. And there's some subset of condo unit owners that have more than two vehicles as well. And a good chunk of them also have zero vehicles, but it's not as many as you might anticipate. All right, next slide. Did some research again off of the Census Bureau and Foundation for Community Association Research that sort of breaks down where most of the condo units are. Again, Florida is really coming in with a lot of units, and the vast majority really, I mean, the top 5 states get you over 50%, and the bottom 34 states plus Puerto Rico and British Columbia, District of Columbia, DC has almost 25%-ish, or sorry, like 15, 20%. So it's, most of the condo units are in specific places. This aggregation was broken off at about 150,000 units for reference. So why install charging at condos? And sort of this shouldn't be too much of a surprise for a lot of people. There's a lot of demand from unit owners and potential future EV driving unit owners that are looking for condo units. This can be a visible symbol that your community is looking at sustainability and green tech, but this is becoming more of a requirement. And I've talked to some condo property managers that have run into the issue where they're looking at potential homeowners that are looking for units, and because the unit doesn't have EV charging as part of their deeded parking space, they're not interested. They'll walk. And if you have communal EV charging, that can be a big aspect for potential home buyers. Yeah, Don, do you want to add anything to that?
I just want to emphasize how much it can really create a symbol for your community that you're not stagnant, that you are thinking about what's coming and what's moving forward. It's very visible, right? It's one of the most visible amenities you can have because it's usually observable from the street or from the parking lot. So it really says a lot about your community to have it.
I'd go beyond just the communal EV charging, but also if you have a deeded parking space that is EV ready, that basically acts the same way as telling future owners that, hey, we're ready for EVs. And there's a big value increase there that's been seen. It's really hard to quantify, but in some places it's been seen $5,000 to $10,000. That was a Portland sort of property that saw those unit increases. All right, next slide. So this is going into background on EV charging. So we're mostly using the same language to describe these. Lots of different industries use different phrasing for amenities and for EV charging, for infrastructure, for communal assets. And so being on the same page for some of that jargon is pretty important. All right, and I don't always get it right. So this is sort of the synopsis, EV 101 backgrounder. It sort of does a decent job of explaining high level what to look for when you're looking for EV charging. Note that any level 2 chargers that are above 50 amp, a 50 amp circuit breaker have to be hardwired according to National Electrical Code. And the cost differences between level 3 and level 2 charging is significant, really, really, really significant. It's easily into the six digits typically for DC fast charging. And that sometimes is before you get into the installation costs on cost of hardware. All right. For multifamily and condo specifically, we're talking level 1 and level 2. Yeah. So I wanna level set on EV readiness because this is a big topic for condos and for sort of phasing installations over time. EV capable means that there's panel capacity and there's conduit near or to the parking space. It doesn't have wiring, doesn't have a receptacle on the end, doesn't have a breaker or yeah, but all you need to do is install that. EV ready is that next level step where you have the wiring, you have the circuit breaker, you have the outlet. And for some in some places, that's actually going to be enough for some properties and for some installation situations. And then EVSE installed is where you have the actual plug all the way to the car. I would also add to this that smart outlets would be closer to the EVSE installed, despite it being an outlet that is being provided because of that smart tech on top of the outlet. All right. Also, to specifically mention that bottom term junction boxes, that's typically what you see in that EV capable situation where there might be a junction box within 10, 15 feet. And sometimes you even see a much larger junction box that is really meant to be a placeholder for future panel capacity or for future conduit runs that might be like a conduit run that runs to 10, 20 different parking spaces. All right. Next up is sort of level setting on sort of the charging configurations. And part of this is recognizing that condos usually have deeded parking spaces. They may have some visitor parking lots. Occasionally you'll see the unassigned parking lots as well. Sometimes there's multiple of these parking lots all in one site. You'll get a cross between assigned and unassigned parking spaces. And then in a different lot, you might have deeded parking spaces that are attached to the deed of the units. And so there's a lot of different parking configurations that then lead themselves into different charging configurations. The two that you'll see at multifamily properties that are focused for the residents, for the unit owners, is first come, first served communal charging. And that requires basically a parking space that is just for charging, and people will move their car after they're done charging or within a grace period. There's typically fewer circuits and potentially lower costs. And yeah, moving on to dedicated chargers, that's basically a charger that is set for that parking space. And usually it's just, for that car that is in that parking space. But in condos, especially where you might have multiple cars and only one deeded parking space, you might have to switch or switch cars so that both cars get to charge. And that's not uncommon in a lot of larger complexes that have more than one parking space per unit and less than what's the word? Not all deeded parking spaces. Don, do you want to add anything more to any of this?
Yeah, thanks, Whit. The point I want to just stomp my foot on here is that parking has been a challenging issue for every condominium I've helped try to get charging installed, whether they're dedicated spots or communal. Every single instance requires creativity from the board to find a way forward on the parking. So just kind of put that on your marker if you're a condominium or a service provider trying to solve this problem at a condominium, parking will be one of your hardest problems to solve. And we can dive into that in the Q&A more.
Yeah, we've got a slide dedicated to our discussion on that. A couple things that are good to know is that it is typically a significantly better user experience, dedicated chargers, because you're not having to, or as the, as the unit owner, the driver, the EV driver, you're not having to repark and to charge. However, typically you get slower speeds when you do a dedicated charger approach. That is typically not a big issue because people are parked for so long that they're able to fully charge and they're going to plug in whenever they're there. And also potentially better for utility demand response programs because when people are charging, they're not charging because they're usually not charging because they absolutely have to. Whereas with the first come, first served communal chargers, you often run into that situation where people are charging because they have to. All right. Next slide up, we've got energy management systems, which is a really important set of technology solutions for people to know when they're thinking about EV charging at multifamily properties and condos specifically. EMSs, energy management systems, monitor, control, and optimize electricity flow. They do so usually between a combination of software and hardware solutions. When I say software solutions, I'm thinking of networked charging stations where you see sort of that brand on the charging unit at the end. Yeah. Whereas hardware enabled, when I'm talking about hardware enabled, I'm thinking about the energy management system sort of resting with the panel and sort of the panel controlling and monitoring the flow of electricity. And there's some complexities there because some systems use both. But typically those are sort of the big distinction that I think about when I'm thinking about energy management systems. There's a lot of different factors for energy management systems. And I know we've got some people on the webinar that know a lot as well. So definitely add some stuff to the chat if you recommend any resources for learning more. A couple things that are particularly important for that are sort of lesser focused on is that scalability. Energy management systems really help you add more chargers as you plan out, as you phase installations over time. And then they can be instrumental for reducing transformer sizing upgrades. And this is particularly important for new developments, but is also actually even more important for existing properties. And utilizing that new capacity as optimally as possible. Emphasizing this, just really emphasizing this, energy management systems really are critical for avoiding service upgrades. And I think utilities are coming around to understanding this really well and integrating that into their incentive programs, but it is taking some time. We're going to go over a little bit on sort of the wiring approaches. A pretty common one is the sort of communal wiring where the association is installing a panel and going to be paying for the electricity that flows through that panel to any EV chargers or any other systems such as HVAC systems and such in garages. But this is a very common one. And then direct to meter wiring. So directly to the owner's meters, and we've got a bunch of pictures in the next slide. But it is a type of energy management system. It puts the charging costs on the tenant or unit owner's utility bill. And this is typically a really optimal situation, so long as the cost to install is not too high, because it removes the association, the condo association's need to deal with billing, to deal with access controls, and other aspects like that. And again, it's pretty common, or it's most effective in these deeded condo spaces, but can be done in other situations in terms like for assigned parking spaces, and even small apartment complexes, which are outside of the scope of this webinar today, but still important to recognize that that can be done. And then I might flip back and forth between the next slide and this one, but there's 4 different ways to connect to do direct to meter wiring. Connect to the meter base, connect between the meter base and the meter, and then directly to the unit panel, which is essentially single family home and is common in townhomes. And then connect to the feeder wire between the meter and the unit panel. There's it'll make more sense with these next pictures. Connecting directly to the meter base itself. You can see this, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the middle picture, the black part that has that 125 breaker symbol, that would be a connection spot. Right above it is the actual 60 amp breaker switch. This is a Siemens InHab power mod. They may have altered the name recently, but I haven't talked with Gary in a while. Anywho, this integrates an EV charging circuit into the meter base, which is awesome. Similarly to that, you integrate the circuit between the meter and the meter base with the Connect DER, as you can see in the right-hand picture. And then the last option is to connect to the wire that goes from the meter all the way up to the unit's meter, the unit's panel, sorry. And there's an example right there that is basically putting that circuit, and the circuit says, hey, we have enough power to run this circuit. And if the panel, the unit's panel, wherever it is, whether it's on the first floor, the 20th floor, or wherever, is pulling too much power, the circuit down connected there will say, we don't have enough power. We can't run this circuit. All right. Wiring directly to the meter takes up space often in the electrical room, and requires the parking spaces to be fairly close to the electrical room and the meter room. In high rises, typically you use a bus bar system and have the unit meters be on their floors, which essentially means this is not possible. And maybe a different webinar will touch upon this, but there's some innovative work going on at some utilities to basically enable integration of chargers or even EV telematics units with utility billing software so that you could get that direct to meter wiring result without actually having to directly wire to the meter. That's for probably a different conversation. There's a lot there and a lot going on in that space. Don, did you want to add anything on any of the direct to meter wiring? Okay.
No, I think we'll leave that to the discussion period.
Yes.
I'll just say that every condominium is unique, and the solution you have to solve for will be unique to your condominium.
So next slide is on right to charge laws, and Don, feel free to stay on for this one. Not a panacea. I think this has been known to the industry for a while now, but there's certainly we're running into the space where more and more condos are realizing that the early the early adopters were able to utilize sort of one-off solutions where they were tacking on a circuit into an existing condo association panel. And there's just no more power left. And so there's a lot of unit owners that are saying, hey, I want to install a charger, and going to their condo board, and the condo board says, well, okay, we don't have any space on any of our panels. We need to find a better solution. And so they're looking for said better solutions. And I'll pass it over to you, Don, for some more details.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the last bullet there is most salient in this scenario. These solutions are so complicated, and there are so many interdependencies that a board that is not interested in supporting EVs can pretty easily just make it so onerous as to not make it a viable approach. And even very interested boards that are trying to move forward may struggle with the solution sets. So if you're an advocate or you're an EV owner, do not just rely on that right to charge law. While it can be helpful in your conversations, it can help move the discussion forward. It is not going to get you to a solution in and of itself.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, there's so many angles we can go off of there, but it's definitely becoming apparent. We've received a lot of inquiries as part of our free consultation program that really emphasize this point, where the condo board is sort of looking at more and more people requesting EV chargers and saying, what can we do? What power capacity do we have? What would be the costs for us to upgrade the service capacity? How long would that take? Do we need to do a load study? Lots of other questions. All right. Oh, there we go. So on to more of our open discussion. Don, were there any questions in the chat that you think are particularly relevant for the architecture and electrical pieces around barriers to condo charging?
No, I think so far we've answered the questions that have been there, and Anna's been sharing some resources to link people out to more information as appropriate.
Perfect. Yeah. So I know when we were talking about this webinar and even long before that, when we were talking about the toolkits, when we were building them out last year, a big piece really is that it's not just the electrical capacity, it's also the parking spaces. Can you talk a little bit more about how condo boards are sort of looking at and facing some of the constraints with their existing parking configurations?
Yeah, I'll offer up a few sort of areas where the conversation usually struggles. So in many more dense areas, the condominium is mandated to have a certain number of parking spaces available. And oddly enough, in many jurisdictions, a dedicated EV charging spot is excluded from that allocation. So there are some condominiums I've worked with who can't do charging because they literally would fall below their minimum required parking spaces. So they're having to work with their local jurisdictions to work on modifying those rules so that they aren't penalized for wanting to install EV charging. You know, parking spaces are often considered common elements, and now you're trying to reserve them. So that's something we had to deal with at my condominium, is we had to come up with a creative way of it's still a common element, but it's a reserved common element. And that got us through our particular hurdle. And there are issues with, you got to be close to the power. So now you're allocating some of the best charging. And so you got to work with your association to kind of get through the politics of that. And it just seems to always come up. In another condominium I'm working with, uh, they only have dedicated parking spots, uh, and so they're working to actually buy two parking spots from their owners so that they can turn them into common charging spots. So not everyone has to install charging. They can literally just have two spots that would allow anyone in the facility to get an EV and use those chargers. But they're struggling to come up with enough money from association funds to buy those spots. So those are a few examples, and we'd happy, if anyone else on the call has other examples, I'm sure they're out there and we could discuss them.
Yeah, I think that one is particularly important that there's so many different routes to do EV charging, but so many of them go through a process of, well, if we want to do that, we need a parking space, and all of the relevant parking spaces are deeded. And therefore you have to go through one, checking your bylaws to see what sort of process you have to go through to do that kind of thing. Then you actually have to identify how much it's going to cost. And there's a lot of factors that run through either run through board votes or eventually get to full member votes. I even heard of one in Portland where it wasn't just a full member vote, but if they didn't get to a certain threshold of owners that voted, it wouldn't matter what the vote what happened with the vote. And that vote passed because they had one more than the amount that they needed. And they had enough people voting in favor of doing what they proposed, but they almost didn't have enough people actually just straight up voting. And so these
Right.
bylaws that are set in stone before even the owner controlled board is put in place. I mean, we're going back to really the developer files these governance documents, before the building is even built. It has to be filed before you can sell a unit. Um, and we'll get into that into a little bit more, but these things, you run into a question of, well, how do I put in an EV charger? Well, I can do this, but oh wait, then I have to deal with a vote, and that can add so much time.
Even
Um,
like, even the deeded parking spots are not, just easily doable either. So like our deeded spots are all underground, under the building. And we had quite a few owners who were really resistant to having charging under the building. So that was one of a number of factors that drove us to just do communal charging outside. And some localities are actually prohibiting charging underground. Uh, and so, just if you're a condo or a developer again thinking, oh, well, I've got deeded parking spots, don't think that that absolves you of the parking challenges.
Yeah, and there is a discussion across the nation, especially between municipalities and their fire departments, where the fire chief says, I don't have a method for putting out this fire that meets my team's needs. And the building permitting department has said, well, we have this permit process, and you go back and forth, and typically everybody's in a lot of the city systems or the city managers are really deferring to their fire departments, which can block out a lot of different pathways. And that's before
This
you.
is yeah, just to build on what Whit just said there, though, this is an excellent opportunity to advocate you reaching out to your city representatives. My city has a really forward-leaning set of staff who are working these issues, and they have been great partners with me in trying to solve this charging at condominiums as well as other citywide challenges. So I encourage you to build relationships with your city staff and see if they can help be part of your solution space.
That's a really good point, and one that I try to mention when I'm working with cities specifically. Um, and I keep moving forward. We can always come back to these slides later on if people have questions. I wanted to take a little bit of time and mention accessibility, and particularly with condos, given that I want to say it's around 65% or 60-ish% of condo owners are over the age of 60. I should have thrown that into the condo background document or page, but anything you want to say a little bit about some of the accessibility challenges of EV charging at condos?
First of all, I feel sad that I now fall into that camp. Uh, um, Yeah, I personally have a mobility challenges. So, I am always an advocate of accessibility in everything you do. Most cities and thank you, Lisa. Um, the uh, there's a variety of requirements around in various city ordinances and state ordinances about whether you will have to do accessibility with your charging. But I would just say, where possible, if you can add it, like the image shows here, just having a clear walkway up to the charge handles can really, really help even everyone. Like we just had some really big winter storms here, and it was really hard to get to our charge cables for a few weeks. And so I encourage people to think about adding accessibility to your charging stalls. At the same time, it may be a bridge too far, and so think about adding it later if you can. But the biggest thing you can do is, just like the picture shows, have a flat surface all the way to the charge handles so you don't have to climb up a curb or get on uneven ground to get to the charge handles.
That's two points here. One, Fourth is working with accessibility consultant, um, and we'll be putting out a multifamily focused accessibility guide in the next month or so. But the second is also I want to apologize for these being DC fast chargers as part of the image, but the example is still relevant, and there's a couple other factors that should be noted. Cable management is particularly useful for cramped spaces. And then you may end up having you may have a lot of spaces that are impacted by pillars. That's particularly common in subterranean lots or just parking garage setups, and that can add complexity. There's also mounting differences, whether it's out in front and may require a bollard or up against a pillar itself. There's a lot of different mounting solutions that need to be taken into consideration when trying to design a charger that is at least operable, if not accessible. And there's a lot of challenges with sort of finding the best option when you're looking at a deeded parking space that has constraints that are really built into the deed. Moving
If
over.
I want to, I would like to reply. Someone, Zara, left a really interesting comment about the state of Colorado and used the term commercial. And this is an interesting area of sort of debate within the condominium world. Uh, we are, are we actually a commercial installation? We use billing software to charge our owners. But for us at our condominium, our master insurance policy holder was emphatic that we not be open up our charging to public use. It is charging only for our condominium owners and visitors. So does that constant, in the context of this Colorado law, would a condominium be considered a commercial level two or DCFC installation? I don't know the answer to that. If Zara knows the answer, that'd be really interesting to
I can
know. But we condos kind of they sit in this netherworld between private and commercial, and they don't really fit in either bin, which is why it's been so hard to find incentives to help condominiums because we're not either of them really. We're something else.
Apologies for any background noise I have on my side. I want to emphasize that typically in that situation, commercial level two is really just talking about a higher grade or higher quality of the charger, but that is an important factor because you really can have residential chargers in condos. You see them all the time, especially when you're using an outlet system. But you similarly also see a lot of commercial grade level two chargers that, my apartment complex that has commercial grade level two chargers, but they're not open to the public. And that's another question around the public, whether the charger is open to the public or not. When you have the charger out in a public lot, that typipally changes some of the accessibility design requirements around those chargers, and can factor into costs, restriping, and other factors that are really important, and particularly for that accessibility design component. That is also a good point, Don, from what you said, is getting into that insurance conversation really early when looking at doing EV charging at condos, is knowing that you're going to have to pull in your insurance folks earlier than later usually. And that's actually a step that we recommend in the toolkit, is making sure that the board understands that either when they start going down the process of planning for EV charging more holistically, or delegating that task to either a committee or a focus group or just an individual on the board, or just an individual that's not on the board, that you're going to need a set of stakeholders that the board talks to, and that the person really doing the people and the people that are doing the planning are going to need to be able to talk to the insurance company, the facilities management, probably again back to the board, possibly counsel, legal counsel, to discuss bylaws and policies, because there's potentially parking enforcement and other factors when you go into actually developing enforcement strategies and consequences for if people don't abide by community expectations. I'm almost wondering if we should skip to this one and then come back to the financial in a second, because we're getting closer to that bylaws and timelines conversation. Any thoughts on the top 2 or 3 reasons why the timelines for EV charging at condos ends up just being so much longer?
Yeah, it is because there are so many people that have to say yes or not say no, more appropriately. It is a fractional ownership environment, which is very different from an apartment, from a townhome, from a single family home. You essentially have to bring the whole condominium along. And when it comes to EVs, sadly, we're still at a point where the majority of people don't see EVs in their future. And so they feel like it is something being done for a minority of people. So you really have to work to build consensus by showing how it adds value to everyone, not just the EV owners. It is an amenity that adds value to everyone's home, and it offers a way of looking forward. You have to show that your finances are fair, that you're not burdening others who don't want an EV with costs to support someone else's transportation. And it just takes a lot of talking and a lot of conversations and a lot of consensus building. We held a number of town hall meetings and community meetings where we listened to the feedback and the concerns and the criticisms. We talked through some of the myths about EV charging. We certainly addressed misperceptions about how much it was going to cost to do the installations. People were thinking it was going to be like $500,000 to install a couple of chargers. And certainly that wasn't the case. And we built a really strong plan that allowed us to move forward, charge, a modest amount for our charging per kilowatt hour, and still recover our costs. Certainly recover our operating costs, and then pay back to the association over time for the capital costs. So it just takes a long time in terms of building consensus.
Well said. Said. You've been through that with your own condo and talking through with a lot of other condos, at least in your area and beyond. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you've seen on sort of the financial side when talking to reserve fund study experts and most condos employ a firm to at least review their reserve funds and how those allocations are made, and whether they can dip into some of those reserve funds to install chargers, and sort of what are the consequences and trade-offs there, because it's a big piece, and there's a lot of consequences for doing different things, whether they're significant or not. There's still ramifications.
Oh yeah, the financial. We could spend the next afternoon discussing that. I'll summarize it this way, though. I'm going to start on what is often portrayed as the simple solution, which is to have an EV charging provider come in and provide what's called a quote unquote turnkey solution. So they will fund everything. They will cover all of the installation costs, and they will put it in as a service to your association. And for boards, that sounds really good on the surface because there's no outlay. The challenge there, though, is the cost per kilowatt hour is going to usually be so high that it disincentivizes actual use of the chargers. So you really want to be wary of that and understand what you're getting into there. So if you say, oh, we're not going to do that, we're going to fund it ourselves, then you have to look at what every state has a condominium law that basically governs what is allowed and not allowed by condominium associations. So that has to kind of be a starting point, and then you roll down to your own individual reserve, your own condominium bylaws about what is allowed and not allowed, and whether you have to do a vote of the association. So, for example, I'm working with another association to install charging, and they're a pretty small condominium, and their bylaws require, I forget the specifics, but let's just call it if the project's going to cost more than $10,000, they got to get half their association to say yes. So if it's a new equipment that has never been there before, they have to get a vote of the association. You know, in our case, our bylaws were flexible enough that we could do the charging install without having to do a vote. The board could make the decision on its own. So you really have to kind of work your way through that. And then if you all get all the way down there and you can say yes, then you have to decide, do your reserves have enough money in them to do it? Do you want to do some sort of special assessment, which I discourage strongly? Um, how do you want to do that? So in our case, we use reserve funds to do the installation, and then we take 15 cents of every kilowatt hour that we charge our EV owners and send that back to our reserves to repay the reserves over time. And we can do that here. There are other states where that probably isn't allowed. And so you really have to look through that and figure out what works for you. If you're talking about deeded parking spots, now you have to decide, where does the association pay and where does the individual owner pay? Like, where is that boundary? Who owns what? Like, if an EV owner has to pay to pull wire all the way to their parking spot, do they now own the wire? Do they have to maintain that wire? How do they have to route it? And so you get into once you start diving down into the details don't get easier, they get harder and more complex. So you just have to start working your way through it. This is where I really emphasize and advocate for condominium boards to try to set a strategic plan or a strategic goal for what they want to achieve. And then committees can work their way through the details while staying aligned with the strategic goal that the board sets, meaning we don't want to use our reserves, or, we want to keep the charging costs low, or, we don't want to do inside charging. And then committees can try to stay within those bounds and work through the permutations of what the options are.
I want to take this a second here to emphasize that that note on really having a vision before tasking any group or individual with pursuing planning and diving into the details. There's a really good section in the existing toolkit on the chargeathome.org website. It's one of the big toolkits. Sorry, there we go, is the first thing after the purpose in that existing toolkit is particularly relevant. Something to note about the new toolkit is that this is actually more for the developer side and doesn't really get into the turnover to the owner side until section 5. But this sort of that letter to condo boards, I think is particularly important on the existing toolkit. because it really gets into decisions that need to be made before you can start thinking about the decisions to make. Um, or else you'll run into issues around, well, do we need to buy a parking space? What issues do we run into? And if you haven't set a vision for what that looks like, you're going to be going back and forth between potentially first come, first served communal charging versus deeded parking, well past when you really should have figured out which pathway to take, or potentially a phased approach where you take one approach in the beginning and then move to a different approach later on. Um,
Yeah,
and
another good example of that is that condominium that was seeking to buy the parking spots. They do have three or four sort of open surface lot parking, but they made a strategic decision that they do not want to consider that. They did not want to have the charging outside. They did not, they didn't want to risk other people coming in. They're in a dense urban area. They didn't want to risk others coming in and using the charging. And so they just excluded that. They just excluded that from the option set and said, if we're going to come up with a solution, it needs to be in our garage.
I think this is also a good time to go back and reference that direct to meter wiring. It can really be a hassle to get through that, but one of the reasons why it's so attractive to boards is you don't have to worry about all of these decisions to be made. You don't have to worry about the complications, the bylaws. You might still end up having to go through some complications and communal maintenance, or maintenance of infrastructure that goes through communal spaces. Um, but you get further away from the building complexities. You get further away from who owns what, where, altering parking spaces, parking space designations, stuff like that. So there's a lot of trade-offs, and typically there's a lot of costs, no matter which way you go. Um, but that's the reason why we built those toolkits. That's why the reason why we're having this conversation here. There's a lot of people in condos that want to have EVs, that want to drive electric, but don't really understand how they could possibly get EV charging because their board has said we can't come up with a solution here. So if you know of any boards that are running into this issue, definitely have them reach out. Um, we're here to support. And we've got 5 more minutes. I want to talk a little bit about the takeaways. And if anybody has questions, now's a good time to do so. Um, so ultimately, I'm gonna just go through the takeaways briefly, and Don, you can jump in after that. Condos are not like apartments, and they're also not like workplaces or businesses. They're sort of both a mixture and a different entity entirely. Their decision-making processes are different and frankly more complex. They have a variety of existing factors such as insurance, bylaw and governance document complications, and more. Um, right to charge laws are becoming no longer sufficient to get unit owners and condo boards to where they need to be. And in some cases, those right to charge laws have really made it a lot harder, because people that now have 40 amp circuits are now running into the situation where their board is saying, we kind of need that power back. And how you deal with that, the politics of it, whether, maybe that person is the president of the board. Maybe they have enough people on the board that they can just sort of close down that conversation. And so you're really getting into a much longer timeline for changing boards, for changing votes, and items along that route. And then last one is adding EV chargings to existing condos is hard, but it is usually doable. And that's it's worthwhile trying to pursue charging if there's enough interest. Pass it over to Don for final thoughts there.
Yeah, I just want to sort of encourage folks to try to get through it. If you are a condominium board member or an EV owner who is in a condominium, it's worth the effort. We are now a year and a half into having charging at our condominium. It was a really long slog for me to get there. But now it's used every day, multiple times a day. There are more EVs on our property today than there were a year and a half ago. It's there, it's visible, it works, and it's just a really nice addition to your community. And I'm confident that in almost every scenario there is a pathway forward, and it can be achieved if you're willing to try to go through those, go through the decision making, sort of tree. There are solutions out there. So I encourage you to reach out to WIT and Fourth, and they're willing to help. We also I've got my email address there if you want to reach out to me. This is something I care a lot about. It's a sort of an avocation for me, so I'm happy to help, happy to talk with anyone, see what kind of solution sets we can get, because it isn't easy. Don't let anyone tell you it's going to be easy at a condominium.
All right. Anna, any last comments?
Not really. Thank you, Whit and Dawn. That was an awesome presentation. Everybody, there's a link to where this presentation will be saved on our website. We'll also send a follow-up email with the slides, a PDF of the slides, as well as the recording link, perhaps tomorrow. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you all.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.